Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now, let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Amarachi had always believed that love was enough, that laughter in a small home could drown out the world's noise, that the gentle touch of her husband's hand could ease her fears, and that a prayer whispered between two hearts could open the heavens. When she married Uchenna, she felt like the luckiest woman in their small village of Umidum. He was handsome, respected, and already successful in his building supplies business. People said she married above her level, but Uchenna always reminded her that love didn't measure worth with money. In the early years, their home was warm with affection. Uchenna bought her silk wrappers from Onitsha, carved her name into his favorite drinking cup, and never let a week go by without calling her my treasure. Amarachi gave him everything: support, loyalty, and a heart that beat only for him. But as months turned into years without the cry of a child in their home, a shadow crept into her soul. The silence at night became louder. Women whispered when she passed, old men folded their arms when her name was mentioned in family meetings, and mothers began warning their sons against barren women who locked destinies. By the 4th year of their marriage, Amarachi's smile had grown heavier, burdened by the weight of shame she did not deserve. She had visited every herbalist her church warned her against, drank concoctions that burned her throat and made her dizzy, laid hands on her belly night after night while tears soaked her pillow. Yet, the womb that longed to carry life remained still. What stung the most wasn't just the cruel gossip, but the gradual change in her husband's eyes. Though Uchenna never raised his voice at first, Amarachi noticed how he now sighed more than he spoke, how he stared blankly at children playing in the yard and didn't reach for her hand in public anymore. Still, he defended her fiercely to outsiders, especially to his mother, Mama Uchenna, a bitter, domineering woman whose tongue was as sharp as a razor's edge. Mama Uchenna had never liked Amarachi. From the beginning, she called her a pretty wrapper with no content. And now, with the absence of a grandchild, the woman's contempt fermented into poison. She visited their house every market day with stories of other women who gave birth after 2 months of marriage. Chioma gave her husband twins just like that. What is Amarachi doing with your life? Brewing hot air. It wasn't long before that poison spilled beyond words and into actions. Mama Uchenna began inviting young women from church over to her son's home and praising their wide hips in front of Amarachi. One day, she placed a baby boy in Uchenna's arms and said, "Feel the weight of a real future." Uchenna laughed it off nervously, but Amarachi saw the flicker in his eyes, the flicker that meant doubt was taking root. And so, she began to fade into herself, like a painting left out in the rain. She stopped attending women's meetings. She barely ate. She wandered from room to room during the day, haunted by the echo of a child's cry she had never heard. One night, as Uchenna sat outside counting coins, a rare sign that his business was now struggling, Amarachi knelt beside him and whispered, "I'm sorry." He looked at her, confused, then sighed, "I don't know who to blame anymore, Amarachi, but I know I'm tired." And with that, the crack that had been creeping silently through their marriage widened into a chasm neither of them knew how to cross. At the heart of Umidum Market, Uchenna's shop was once the busiest. Merchants hailed him as Odogwu Nku, the king of building materials. His name was respected across villages, not only for his wealth, but for his integrity. But as time passed and Amarachi remained childless, an unseen wind of misfortune began to sweep through his business. First, it was a shipment of rods that got damaged in the rain due to a leaking warehouse. Then it was a trusted staff member who fled with 3.8 million Nigerian nairas meant for supplies. Orders began to slow, and whispers followed him through the market like shadows. "He's paying for marrying a barren woman," some said, shaking their heads. "No legacy, no luck." Uchenna, once confident and spirited, began shrinking. He stopped buying wine for his customers, stopped laughing loudly, and started counting every naira. Amarachi noticed the change, but every attempt to comfort him was met with a wall of silence. The warmth in their home had begun to cool, And the woman who once believed love could fix anything now stared at cracks. Even love couldn't mend. Mama Uchenna, who had always nursed contempt for Amarachi, wasted no time deepening the damage. She visited her son daily, always at sunrise like a cock heralding a new day, except her words didn't bless, they burned. When I warned you about her, you said I was old and bitter, she'd snap as she dropped her wrapper on the couch. Now your enemies are dancing with joy. Your mates are building second houses, but you're stuck feeding a woman who feeds you bad luck. The worst part wasn't her words, but Uchenna's silence. He no longer defended Amarachi like before. Sometimes he stared into space as Mama ranted. Other times he nodded slowly, lost in thought. Amarachi began to feel like a stranger, not just in her own home, but in her husband's life. She stopped praying aloud, stopped dressing up for market days, and even stopped pressing his clothes with the little joy she once had. Every evening she cooked with a heavy heart, knowing the food wouldn't heal, the hunger growing in Uchenna's spirit. The only thing worse than a failing marriage is watching it fail while still in the same room. Then came the suggestion that broke what was left of Amarachi's peace. You will marry another wife, Mama Uchenna declared one morning, pouring palm oil into Uchenna's soup with the boldness of a woman who knew she had won. This house needs laughter. It needs a child to chase lizards and fill it with noise. Let this woman stay here and cook, but let someone else carry your seed. Amarachi stood frozen by the door, her hands clenched at her side. She didn't cry, not this time. She had cried herself dry. Uchenna didn't argue. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. And that was the beginning of the end. 2 moons later, a slim, smooth-skinned girl named Jinika moved into their compound. She was young, vibrant, and everything the village praised. And just like that, Amarachi's world, once filled with dreams and waiting, began to rot in silence. What do you call a home where you no longer exist? Amarachi simply called it survival. Jinika's arrival was announced not by trumpet, but by giggles and loud footsteps. She walked into the house like she already owned it, her hair braided into sharp lines, her clothes hugging her curves, and her eyes filled with a kind of hunger Amarachi had never seen before. Mama Uchenna welcomed her like a long-lost daughter, immediately laying down rules. Jinika would eat with Uchenna, take care of his clothes, and join him at night. Amarachi, the once adored wife, was now referred to as that woman or the first tenant. Amarachi didn't fight. She simply watched, broken yet not completely dead. She cooked when needed, cleaned when asked, and prayed only in whispers. But inside, her heart was bleeding in silence. Watching another woman sit where she once sat, laugh with the man she once held, and share his bed while she lay alone in the next room, was a torment only her pillow truly understood. The village buzzed with talk. Some pitied Amarachi, others mocked her. See her, a market woman once said, chewing groundnut while pointing. Too proud to leave, yet too weak to fight. Children sang songs outside her gate about women who watched their homes burn without fetching water. Jinika, emboldened by the attention, began to throw subtle jabs. Some women use years to waste a man's destiny, she would say while pounding yam loudly. Amarachi heard it all and said nothing. The most painful insult came the day Jinika dropped a bowl of okra soup and Amarachi bent to help her clean it. You shouldn't kneel so much, Jinika sneered. It doesn't make children fall from the sky. Uchenna, who stood by the doorway, didn't say a word. That silence, heavier than any slap, told Amarachi everything she needed to know. Her husband was no longer hers. Yet despite it all, Amarachi did not leave. She believed that sometimes strength wasn't in raising your voice, but in holding your peace. She still greeted everyone, still watered the garden, still set Uchenna's food, even if it remained untouched. She chose to be kind even when no one noticed. Mama Uchenna continued to worsen the tension. How can one house carry both light and darkness? She asked one morning, pouring libation near the compound tree. Let the gods choose. And the gods did. One night, Amarachi walked past Jinika's room and heard the sound she had longed to hear for years, laughter followed by the announcement, I think I'm pregnant. That night, Amarachi stood outside beneath the moonlight, her eyes to the heavens, not begging for a child anymore, but asking for mercy. She no longer wanted to be loved. She just wanted to survive. The days that followed Jinika's pregnancy were drenched in a cruel celebration. Mama Uchenna threw a feast before even confirming it. Neighbors trooped in with yam, wrappers, and congratulatory messages. Jinika walked around with a proud smirk, hand always resting on her still flat belly. Amarachi became invisible, a ghost floating through rooms she once decorated. Uchenna started avoiding eye contact. He became a different man, snappier, more distant, and strangely cruel. He no longer responded when Amarachi greeted him. If her food lacked salt, he poured it into the gutter. If she coughed, he told her to go outside. "You've infected this house with your sadness," he once said, without looking up from his plate. The man who once prayed with her now prayed against her. Even the walls seemed to resent her presence. The home that once held love had turned into a theater of whispers and bitterness, where Amarachi was always the villain. Yet she endured. She cleaned the compound before sunrise, fetched water for Jinika when she faked fatigue, and even helped sweep Mama Uchenna's room when her back hurt. But no matter what she did, it was never enough. Which, Mama Uchenna would mutter under her breath, still pretending to be good. Jinika joined in, accusing her of jealousy. "Your presence threatens my baby," she hissed one morning. "Leave this house, or I'll miscarry." Amarachi stood there, silent, her eyes swollen from nights without sleep. What do you say when your silence is hated and your presence feared? Amarachi didn't know any more. One night, she overheard Uchenna telling Jinika, "Maybe it's time she left. I don't want anything ruining this baby." Her heart shattered again, not from shock, but from exhaustion. There was no grief left to offer. But just when all hope seemed lost, a miracle bloomed in the wilderness of her pain. Amarachi began to feel strange, morning nausea, fatigue, and a heaviness in her belly. At first, she ignored it. But a visit to the local chemist confirmed what seemed impossible. She was pregnant. The woman who had been declared barren, who had been spat on, beaten by silence and bruised by rejection, now carried life. When the news reached the compound, no one believed it. "She's faking it," Jinika screamed. "She wants attention." But the midwife confirmed it. "Mama Uchenna's face twisted in shock." Amarachi did not gloat. She simply folded her wrapper and returned to her room. She would not dance to prove her joy. She had already bled too much for this moment. And somewhere deep inside her, a quiet war had begun. She would carry these babies not to prove a point, but to reclaim her dignity, even if it cost her everything. As Amarachi's pregnancy began to show, a different storm brewed around her. Instead of joy, she was met with suspicion. The same people who once mocked her for being barren now whispered that she must have used charms to become pregnant. The whispers weren't just outside. They roared within the very walls she called home. Mama Uchenna grew colder, eyes constantly narrowed, lips pursed like someone preparing to spit poison. Jinika fumed with jealousy, despite her own pregnancy, and began accusing Amarachi of trying to harm her unborn child. She would scream over any little issue, claiming that Amarachi's presence gave her nightmares. Uchenna, caught between the two women, didn't defend Amarachi. Instead, he avoided her entirely. The man who once held her hand and prayed for a child now walked past her like a shadow in the wind. Amarachi felt like a ticking clock no one wanted to hear, a miracle wrapped in rejection. With every passing day, Amarachi's belly grew, and so did the hatred in the household. She was denied proper meals, made to cook and clean while Jinika rested like a queen. Mama Uchenna claimed it was her punishment for locking her womb for years and now trying to steal attention from the real wife. Amarachi often found herself sitting alone at the edge of the compound at night, rubbing her belly and whispering apologies to the lives growing inside her. "Forgive me, my children," she would murmur. "I wanted you to be born into love, not into war." Her heart ached at the idea that her babies might never know a father's warmth. And yet, she stayed. Not because she lacked options, but because she believed no child should be born homeless. That faith became her anchor in a sea of torment. Then the unthinkable happened. One evening, after Jinika had returned from the market bragging about the baby clothes she'd bought, she collapsed by the kitchen door. She was rushed to the hospital, and the verdict was clear: a miscarriage. The house turned into a volcano. Mama Uchenna, wild with grief, blamed Amarachi immediately. "You used juju," she screamed, slapping Amarachi so hard she saw stars. "You cursed her womb to open yours." The next morning, a group of village women came to the house for a cleansing. They poured ash water at Amarachi's doorstep and sang songs about women who eat other women's children. Uchenna said nothing. When Amarachi cried out to him, he stared at her with hollow eyes. "Maybe you are the reason for all this," he muttered. That night, Amarachi didn't sleep. Her babies kicked, as if reacting to the chaos outside. She held her belly and wept quietly. For the first time, she feared not just for herself, but for the innocent lives she was bringing into a world that already hated them. Amarachi's labor started on a rainy night. The sky rumbled like a wounded beast, and thunder cracked across the heavens, as if announcing a sacred event. Uchenna was nowhere to be found, and Mama Uchenna had locked herself in her room, still mourning Jinika's miscarriage. Amarachi dragged herself through the contractions with no help, each wave of pain met with silence. It wasn't until the 4th hour that an old neighbor, Maman, woke, heard her cries, and rushed in. The midwife was called, and with trembling hands and tearful eyes, Amarachi gave birth not to one, but 2 beautiful, healthy boys. The room lit up with cries, the kind she had waited years to hear. Yet the moment was not filled with joy. Before the first cock could crow, news came. Mama Uchenna had died in her sleep. The joy of birth clashed violently with the sting of death. And the village, never short of rumors, pointed their fingers at one name: Amarachi. She killed her mother-in-law the moment she had her sons. She's a witch. The twins are a curse. The cries echoed from compound to compound. People avoided her gate. Some crossed themselves when they saw her. What should have been a celebration turned into mourning laced with hate. Even Uchenna, who returned the next day, didn't ask to see his sons. Instead, he went straight to his mother's room, wept loudly, and emerged with a face full of rage. "This house cannot contain both death and evil," he hissed. "Take your cursed twins and leave my home." Amarachi stared at him in disbelief, the 2 infants wrapped in her arms, eyes barely open to the world. She begged, she pleaded, she knelt, not for herself, but for her boys. "Please don't do this. They're your blood." But Uchenna was unmoved. "You waited this long just to bring sorrow," he snapped. "You and those children leave." With nothing but a small bag of clothes, and her babies clutched to her chest, Amarachi walked out into the early dawn. The road was wet, her wrapper soaked with rain and milk, but she walked with the strength only a mother can summon. She wandered through the village like a ghost, knocking on doors, begging for shelter. Most turned her away. Fear and gossip had poisoned even the kindest hearts. Eventually, she found refuge in an abandoned stall near the river. With old sacks as beds and her back as a shield against the cold, she nursed her sons, rocking them to sleep with songs her mother once sang. Her heart was shattered, but not broken. Her tears flowed, but her spirit held on. She knew, deep within her, that this pain was not the end. It was the beginning of a storm that would one day pass, and she would rise with the sunrise. Word spread fast through Yumadam. Amarachi has been cast out. She was the curse all along. People watched her with pity, some with amusement. She sat outside the stall during the day, nursing her twins, and at night she wrapped them in faded shawls, using her arms as their first crib. Hunger danced in her belly, but she saved every crumb for her boys. When they cried, she cried with them. But she never gave up. She went from house to house offering to wash clothes, sweep compounds, or fetch water, anything that would give her money to buy pap and yam. And slowly, her dignity found a new home, not in riches, not in recognition, but in survival. The same villagers who mocked her began to look at her differently. There was something unbreakable in her walk, something holy in the way she whispered, "Thank you," even when given nothing. Amarachi had become a woman of silent strength. It was on one of those weary days that she met Ease, a widower who ran a small bicycle repair shed by the market. He noticed how she struggled to balance a bowl of laundry on her head while carrying her babies on her back and chest. He offered her water first, then shade, and eventually work. She scrubbed his workshop floors, helped sell spare parts, and for the first time in months, slept in a place with a roof. Ease never asked questions. He didn't pry into her past, only watched her with respect and a quiet admiration that grew each day. Her twins, Ibuka and Samto, took to him quickly. They laughed when he tickled their feet and cried when he left. Amarachi, hesitant at first, slowly let her guard down. In Ease, she saw kindness without motive. In herself, she saw the first hints of healing. Her scars were still fresh, but the wound had stopped bleeding. Meanwhile, back at Uchena's compound, a different kind of curse had begun to grow. Jinika, now bitter and suspicious, haunted every corner with complaints and accusations. Her son, Chisholm, born shortly after Amarachi's departure, was unruly from birth. Uchenna tried to focus on rebuilding his business, but nothing worked. His fortune shrunk faster than he could blink, and every deal he chased crumbled like ash. His home was no longer a place of peace, but a battlefield of entitlement and regret. Still, pride blinded him. He never once asked about Amarachi or the twins. In his mind, they no longer existed. What he didn't know was that the very children he rejected, the ones he cursed, were growing under the arms of love, strength, and grace. And one day, the roads they walked would lead back to him, carrying not just fate, but judgment. The tiny workshop behind Umidum Market became Amarachi's new sanctuary, a place where pain quietly turned into purpose. It was there that she started rebuilding her life with trembling hands and a quiet spirit. Ease, who offered her that refuge without questions, slowly became more than a helper. He was patient, never pushing, always offering food, kindness, and an occasional smile that softened Amarachi's hardened heart. Her twins, Ibuka and Samto, grew up crawling among tires and spanners, their giggles echoing through the wooden stall like healing songs. Amarachi often looked at them with tears in her eyes, not from sorrow anymore, but gratitude. She had lost everything once, her marriage, her dignity, her home, but in their tiny faces, she saw a reason to live again. She worked long hours, washing, selling, fetching, and saving every kobo she could. Slowly, she began baking small chin-chin bags to sell in front of the workshop. People started stopping by, not just for bike parts, but for her snacks and her story. Though she never told anyone the full truth, everyone in the market knew fragments of her shame. Yet over time, they stopped calling her the cursed woman and started calling her the strong one. Her humility and determination disarmed even her worst critics. It was Ease who encouraged her to let the twins attend school. He offered to pay the fees until she was able to take over. Amarachi wept the first time she saw Ibuka recite the alphabet and Samto write his name in chalk. "They will grow to be better than anything this world expects," Ease said one evening, watching the boys run around the shop. Amarachi believed him. Every night she prayed over them, not that they'd become rich or powerful, but that they would never carry bitterness. She wanted them to grow with clean hearts, free from the filth of their father's rejection. The love in that little workshop wasn't loud or perfect, but it was real, and it was enough. Still, in the quiet corners of her heart, Amarachi sometimes thought about Uchenna. She wondered if he ever looked back and regretted. She wondered if he ever asked about the twins or even remembered their names. But she refused to let those thoughts linger. She had chosen peace. Ease, too, began to grow closer. He helped the boys with homework, repaired their broken toys, and even carved wooden alphabet blocks for them. Eventually, he asked Amarachi a question that made her heart stop. "Would you let me be their father?" She didn't answer right away. Her heart, still carrying old bruises, struggled to trust new joy. But weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning, she whispered yes, not just to Ease, but to healing. And with that, a new family was born. Not from perfection, but from survival. Not from wealth, but from warmth. And for the first time since her exile, Amarachi slept that night without fear. Ibuka and Santo grew like bamboo in the rainy season, strong, swift, and deeply rooted. Though they were twins, they were different in personality. Ibuka, the elder by just minutes, was calm, analytical, and carried a natural curiosity about the human body. Santo, on the other hand, was bold, hands-on, and had a talent for machines. By the time they were 15, their personalities had already carved their paths. Ibuka dreamed of becoming a doctor, inspired by the memory of watching their neighbor's son die from snakebite because there was no clinic nearby. Santo, meanwhile, began helping ease at the workshop, fixing tires, learning engine sounds by memory, and even drawing his own designs for Kiki and small cars. Amarachi watched them with pride, though she kept one secret buried deep, the truth about their biological father. To them, Ease was daddy, and he wore that name with honor. He never tried to replace Uchenna, but he loved the boys in a way their real father never did, with patience, presence, and praise. Amarachi often felt torn. She wanted to protect her sons from the pain of their origins, but deep down, she knew the day would come when they'd ask questions. For now, she poured her energy into building a small food stall beside the workshop, using her profits to support their schooling. Ibuka earned a scholarship to study medicine in the city, and Santo, with Isa's support, opened a small car rental business by the time he was 20. They were humble, focused young men who treated people with respect, traits that came from watching their mother suffer without bitterness. The villagers who once called Amarachi a curse now bowed in admiration. She raised men, they whispered, and she did it with nothing. Amarachi would smile and thank them politely, but inside she knew the truth. She raised them not with money, but with love and scars. Still, there were moments of quiet ache. Whenever Ibuka returned from the city, or Santo brought an extra profit, Amarachi would sneak away and cry in secret. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming irony that the man who rejected these boys now lived somewhere with the son he thought would bring him glory. She had heard stories from the market about Uchenna's new wife, Jinika, and their son, Chisholm. That boy's fire, people would whisper, always in one police station or another. Amarachi never spoke ill of them. She would simply nod and walk away. Ease once asked her if she would ever tell the twins the truth. She didn't respond for a long time, then finally said, when they are strong enough to carry that pain and not hate him. Until then, the secret stayed buried, locked in her chest with every heartbeat. Back at Uchenna's once grand compound, the silence that now filled the halls was not peace, but defeat. His wealth, which had once flowed like a river, had dried into a stubborn puddle. His business collapsed after multiple bad investments and fraudulent deals orchestrated by those he trusted. Jinika, who once adorned herself like a queen, now yelled at him for every little inconvenience. I didn't sign up for poverty, she would scream, hurling insults as easily as she once flirted. The love that once bloomed between them had shriveled into resentment. And their son, Chisholm, was a storm Uchenna could no longer control. The boy stole from neighbors, disrespected elders, and was often brought home by the police. At 18, he had already been suspended from school 3 times. Uchenna tried to discipline him, but Chisholm only laughed. You're too weak, he'd say. You rejected the wrong sons and kept the curse. Those words, cruel and unfiltered, pierced Uchenna deeper than any wound. The villagers had long stopped respecting him. They crossed to the other side of the road when he walked by. Some muttered, that's the man who chased out his real blessings. Others pitied him, shaking their heads at how life had humbled the once mighty. Even his extended family abandoned him. Jinika's family no longer visited, and every day she reminded him how worthless he had become. If you had married a fruitful woman first, maybe your luck wouldn't have died, she spat one evening. Uchenna sat alone that night, watching the last candle in the house burn out. In the dark, he saw the faces of the twins he had never held, never named, never loved. He didn't know what they looked like now, but he remembered their cries that night, sharp, strong, full of life. He had silenced those cries with hatred. Now, all he heard in his compound were shouts, curses, and breaking plates. Despite it all, Uchenna never went looking for Amarachi. Pride, the very thing that pushed him to cast her out, still chained his feet. But his spirit knew. It knew he had made the worst mistake of his life. And every time Chisholm returned with stolen money or bruised knuckles, that truth screamed louder. The very child he thought would redeem him had become his punishment. And somewhere out there were two sons, sons of silence, strength, and sacrifice, growing into men he would never know. Life had a way of repaying what was thrown away. And for Uchenna, repayment had just begun. Chisholm had grown into a name spoken with dread. His reputation was no longer a rumor. It was a reality that lingered like a bad stench across Humidum. At barely 18, he had been caught stealing mobile phones, breaking into shops, and once even accused of stabbing another youth during a gang fight. Uchenna paid bribes to keep him out of jail. Jinika screamed at the world, but shielded her son from consequence. "He's just misunderstood," she'd say, blaming everyone but herself. But deep down, she knew her son was slipping through her fingers like dry sand. Chisholm wasn't just wild, he was angry. He lashed out at everything and everyone, especially Uchenna. "You're a useless man," he often spat. "You think I'm stupid? I know I wasn't your choice. You settled for us after driving out the woman who should have stayed." His words hit Uchenna like blades, because deep down even he could not deny the bitter truth. The entire village had grown tired of Chisholm's presence. Children ran when they saw him. Market women whispered behind baskets. Elders stopped inviting Uchenna to meetings, not because he was poor, but because his home had become a cautionary tale. "Let's not end like Uchenna," they'd mutter in private. His once glorious mansion now stood like a haunted shell, broken gates, cracked walls, overgrown weeds, and a man inside who barely left his room. Jinika still pretended she was a queen, yet she had started selling her clothes just to buy food. Her gold bangles were gone. Her wigs, once imported, were now replaced with cheap scarves. Uchenna tried to talk to Chisholm, to reach into him and salvage what was left. But every effort was met with contempt. "The only reason you're still breathing is because of my mother," Chisholm growled one night. "But I swear, the day she drops, I'll make you disappear too." Uchenna didn't sleep that night. He lay in the darkness, the ceiling spinning, his past echoing louder than his present. He thought of Amarachi, her silence, her dignity, her refusal to curse him even when he cast her out. And the twins, those small bodies he never held, whose eyes he never saw. Where were they now? Were they like Chisholm? Did they turn bitter like him? Or had they found a better life? One free from the filth he had raised? He wanted to ask, to search, but fear choked him. Not of rejection, but of the truth. That the children he once called cursed may have become his only salvation, and he might have thrown them away for nothing. In a modest church surrounded by golden cassava fields, Amarachi stood before the altar, holding the calloused hand of the man who had helped rebuild her life. Ease looked at her not with the eyes of a rescuer, but of a partner, one who saw her strength, not her scars. The ceremony was small, just a few friends from the market, neighbors who had watched Amarachi rise from ashes, and her twin sons, now young men, standing proudly in simple suits. There was no orchestra, no flamboyance, just warm smiles and tears of quiet triumph. Amarachi didn't marry for love alone this time. She married for peace. For all the nights she had been humiliated, for every slap of rejection she swallowed in silence, she now wore a ring that symbolized not just union, but healing. Ibuka and Samto beamed as their mother exchanged vows. To them, Ease was already their father. He had taught them honesty, how to change tires, how to pray with faith even when nothing made sense. They had grown under his guidance, but it wasn't until that day, watching him wipe tears from Amarachi's face at the altar, that they realized how powerful it was to be chosen, not by blood, but by heart. Samto whispered to Ibuka during a reception, "If this is what Dad looks like, then we hit jackpot." Ibuka smiled and nodded, not knowing the truth, not yet. Amarachi had made peace with the past, but she had not yet shared it. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was just waiting for the right time. She didn't want bitterness to poison their view of who they were. Her new ring sparkled in the sun, but it was her heart that shone the brightest. After the wedding, Amarachi and Ease expanded the bicycle workshop into a small mechanic and car rental hub. Samto managed that part with brilliance, attracting tourists and businessmen with honest service and reliability. Ibuka returned to medical school in the city, now in his 4th year, often coming back on holidays to help in the church clinic nearby. They lived modestly but with contentment. Every dinner was filled with laughter, and every conversation carried the wisdom of suffering transformed into strength. Amarachi watched her sons grow into men she was proud of. Men she had raised with no luxury, no support, no inheritance, just faith, endurance, and God. Yet in her heart, she knew a time would come when she'd have to sit them down and tell them the story of a man named Uchenna, a name they barely remembered, but would one day be forced to face. And when that day came, she prayed they would choose forgiveness, not because he deserved it, but because they deserve peace. Back in the crumbling compound that once stood like a monument to success, Uchenna stared at a wrinkled brown file that held the only thing he had left, the documents to his last property. It wasn't much, just a modest piece of land on the edge of the village, but it held enough value to fetch some quick cash. Jinika had pressured him for weeks. "Sell it and let's go to Lagos," she whined. "I can't keep living like a prisoner in this place." Chisholm had other plans. He had overheard his father's conversations and was already plotting with 2 street boys in the next village to intercept the money. "We go wait for Am for road," Chisholm whispered to his friends, eyes gleaming. "Nah small pain. No kill Am. Just take the money. Old man go day, all right." He didn't know that fate had its own plans not even his mother knew about. Uchenna dressed the morning he was to sell the land with slow hands and a heavy heart. He wore the same cream-colored shirt he had worn to bury his mother, now faded and missing a button. He told Jinika he'd be back by dusk. She didn't bother to wish him well, just waved him off and went back to watching soap operas on her old crack phone. The ride to the lawyer's office was quiet, his thoughts echoing louder than the road. He signed the documents, collected the cash in a brown envelope, and began the walk back toward the main junction where he would board a bike. But as he turned into a narrow path near the bushy outskirts of the village, 2 masked boys emerged. "Drop the bag," one shouted. Uchenna froze. "Please, this is all I have." One of them stepped forward and struck him with a plank. He fell. A shot rang out, not aimed but panicked. And then silence. The boys ran, one of them dropping a keychain with the initials CO, unnoticed in their scramble. Uchenna lay bleeding on the dusty ground, eyes fluttering, hands clutching the soaked envelope that now held blood and money. His breath grew shallow, his vision blurred. Cars passed, motorcycles zipped by, but no one stopped. Until one car screeched and reversed. A man jumped out, young, tall, and dark-skinned. He ran to Uchenna, shouted for help, then gently lifted the man into the back seat of his Toyota Corolla. That man was Ibuka. He had been on his way to visit the local clinic when he saw the figure on the road. He didn't know he had just picked up the father who once left him to die. And inside the hospital, as nurses rushed Uchenna into emergency care, a phone rang in Ibuka's pocket, his mother's name flashing across the screen. Ibuka had always believed that destiny had a strange way of circling back to old wounds, not to punish, but to force healing. Yet as he carried the unconscious man into the emergency ward, his mind wasn't on fate, it was on saving a life. The man's shirt was soaked with blood, the brown envelope glued to his chest by both cash and crimson. Ibuka shouted instructions to the nurses, put on his gloves, and immediately began attending to the wound. He didn't recognize the man, not yet. The face was swollen, bruised, and partially obscured by blood. But something about the man's presence stirred a strange ache in Ibuka's chest, like a shadow he had once met but never truly seen. As he cleaned the wound and prepared for minor surgery, the envelope was taken aside by a nurse, revealing bundles of Naira notes and a piece of land document signed with the name, Uchenna Madu. The name struck a chord in Ibuka's heart, though he couldn't immediately place it. He continued working, stitching the man's side, securing drips, and stabilizing his vitals. Only after the surgery, when the man had been sedated and rolled into a ward, did Ibuka walk over to the counter and stare at the name again. Uchenna, he whispered. The name felt oddly familiar, like a ghost brushing past the edges of his memory. He called Santo, who was just finishing a rental drop-off. Bro, something strange just happened, Ibuka said over the phone. I saved a man today, an old man, and his name is Uchenna. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Santo replied, Ibuka, that was Mom's husband. That's our father. The words hit like a truck. Ibuka sat down slowly, the pieces falling into place. The man he had just saved, the stranger lying unconscious in the hospital, was the man who abandoned him as a baby and rejected his existence. Santo arrived an hour later, panting, eyes wide, his mind refusing to believe it until he saw the man himself. They stood over the hospital bed in silence. Uchenna looked smaller now, weaker, a ghost of the man their mother had once described. He doesn't even look like someone we should hate, Santo murmured. He looks lost. Ibuka clenched his jaw. Because he is. He lost everything. Neither of them knew what to do, whether to walk away or stay. Their mother had never poisoned them against him, but they now saw the man behind the silence, and it hurt. That night, neither of them slept. Ibuka stayed at the hospital, watching the monitors, listening to the rhythmic beep of the machine, knowing that the very man who left them to die was now alive, because of them. He didn't know if it was mercy, fate, or irony. All he knew was that life had just opened a chapter he never planned to read. Morning broke with golden streaks in the sky, but the hospital room felt heavy. Uchenna lay still, breathing, but unconscious. Ibuka, still in his scrubs, hadn't left the ward since the previous night. He sat by the window, his mind torn between his oath as a doctor and the raw storm brewing in his chest. How did one treat a man who once discarded you like waste? How do you save the life of the man who gave you none? Yet somewhere in the depth of that dilemma, Ibuka found clarity, not for Uchenna, but for himself. He couldn't be the kind of man his father was. He had been raised by love, by pain, by a woman who had every right to be bitter, but chose strength instead. We saved him, he said quietly to himself, because we were raised better. Santo brought him coffee that morning and said the same thing in different words. This isn't for him. It's for us. By the second day, Uchenna stirred. His fingers twitched, and his eyes fluttered open. The room was dim, and a nurse immediately called for Ibuka. When he entered, Uchenna's eyes tried to focus, darting left and right. Where am I?" he asked, voice dry and weak. "You're in the hospital," Ibuka replied, his voice low but steady. Uchenna turned to look at him. For a moment there was confusion, then something strange happened, recognition. Uchenna croaked. "You look like," he didn't finish. Ibuka didn't answer either. He stood still, unreadable. Santo entered next, and Uchenna's mouth opened again. "Who are you people?" he asked, eyes wide with fear. "What do you want from me?" Santo placed the land document on the table beside him. "We don't want anything from you. You were robbed and left to die. We saved you. That's all." Uchenna stared at them, unsure whether to be grateful or afraid. The world had turned upside down, and the sons he abandoned were now the only ones keeping him alive. Over the next few days, Uchenna slowly recovered. But with each passing hour, guilt festered like an infection. He watched how Santo cleaned the room without a word, how Ibuka gave instructions to the nurses like a man who had done this for years, professionally, yes, but also with quiet honor. He recognized the dignity in their gestures and saw his own shame reflected in their silence. One afternoon, he broke. "Who are you really?" he asked. "You remind me of someone." Ibuka stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed. "We're your sons, the ones you called cursed." The words were sharp but calm. Uchenna froze, lips trembling. "No, it can't be," he whispered. But it was. The blood that once cried at birth now stood in white coats and work clothes, not for revenge, but as proof that even what is thrown away can still rise again. Back at home, Amarachi stood still as a statue, the phone pressed to her ear, her heart pounding like thunder trapped in her chest. "Mom," Ibuka had said softly over the line, "he's alive. And we saved him." For a moment, she said nothing. The world around her spun. The walls, the stove, even the scent of boiling rice blurred. She sat down slowly, tears filling her eyes. After all these years, after shame, exile, and silence, the man who once cursed her existence was now alive because her sons had spared his. She remembered his words the night he threw her out. "Take your cursed twins and go." Yet now, those same curses were his salvation. Ease found her there minutes later, her face buried in trembling hands. He didn't need to ask. One look at her told him what had happened. "He's awake," he asked gently. Amarachi nodded. "And the boys, they know now." She made the decision to go to the hospital the next morning, not for closure, but to see for herself the man who once broke her. She dressed modestly, tied her scarf with shaking fingers, and walked into the hospital with dignity. The nurses whispered as she passed. There was something queenly about her still. When she entered the room, Uchenna was sitting up, staring out the window. The moment he saw her, his eyes widened in disbelief. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Amarachi didn't cry, didn't shout. She simply stood by the door, looked at him, and said, "Now you see what you lost." He opened his mouth, then covered his face with both hands. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "I didn't know. I was foolish. I was blind." She sat down beside him, but kept her distance. "You were everything but deaf," she said quietly. "You heard my cries. You saw me leave with your sons. And you didn't stop me." They spoke for hours, not about reconciliation, but about reality. Amarachi told him about the nights she slept under stalls, how she begged for food, how the boys took their first steps without him. Uchenna wept, truly wept, and not just for what he did, but for what he missed. "I don't deserve their kindness," he whispered. "You don't," she replied. "But they gave it anyway. Because they're not like you." Uchenna looked at her, voice trembling. "Will you ever forgive me?" She looked at him for a long time, then said, "I've already moved on. Forgiveness isn't for you. It's for me. But don't mistake my peace for acceptance. I may have healed, but my scars still speak." As she stood to leave, he grabbed her hand and sobbed. She let him hold it for just a moment, not in love, but in farewell. And as she walked out of that hospital room, a chapter closed quietly behind her. But the mystery of what had truly happened that day on the road was just beginning to unfold. Uchenna sat alone in the hospital room for hours after Amarachi left, his hands trembling as if his body refused to carry the weight of his memories. He stared at the ford drip as if the slow drops of saline were counting the years he had wasted. Each moment brought a flash. Amarachi's cries as she was thrown out in the rain, the twins' tiny bodies wrapped in cloth he never touched, the coldness he called discipline, the pride he wore like armor while he bled everyone who loved him. And now he was nothing but a wounded man lying in a hospital bed, paid for by the very sons he denied. For the first time, the full gravity of his decisions struck him like a whip to the soul. "I destroyed everything," he whispered. "Everything that ever mattered." There was no mother-in-law to blame now, no wife to defend him. Jinika had not even called. The truth unraveled slowly. He asked for a mirror and stared long at his reflection. His face, once proud and chiseled, was now sagged with grief and regret. The silence in the hospital was deafening, broken only by the distant footsteps of nurses and the mechanical beeping of machines. When the doctor came in to check his vitals, Uchenna asked softly, "Can I see them, my sons?" The doctor nodded. Hours passed before Ibuka and Santo walked in, dressed in everyday clothes, not as strangers this time, but not as family either. They stood still, eyes firm, waiting for him to speak. Uchenna looked at them with tears in his eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, "but I want to thank you, not just for saving my life, but for proving I was wrong about everything." His voice cracked. "You are not curses. You are miracles. And I was blind. Samto remained still, his jaw tight. You didn't just leave, he said. You tried to erase us. You gave us pain we didn't deserve. Uchenna nodded, swallowing the shame. I know, he whispered. Ibuka finally stepped forward. We're not here to make peace, he said. We've made peace with ourselves, with our mother, with the life we've lived. But we won't carry your guilt too. That's yours to live with. Uchenna closed his eyes as a tear rolled down. It was the truth, not anger, not hate, but a boundary drawn from deep wounds. As they turned to leave, he said softly, Can I just know what you've become? Samto paused. One of us is a doctor. The other runs a car rental business. The same twins you call bad luck. They left without waiting for a reply, their footsteps echoing through the hallway like the sound of justice walking away. While Uchenna lay in the hospital, finally facing the consequences of his past, back home, something darker was unraveling. Jinika paced the compound like a woman under siege. Her plans had not gone as expected. The money Uchenna was supposed to return with never arrived. Instead, rumors were spreading across Umidum that he had been attacked and saved by two young men, sons of Amarachi. That last part was like acid to Jinika's ears. She tried to reach Chisholm, but he had been missing since the evening of the robbery. Days passed with no word. Her fear grew, not because she missed her son, but because she knew Chisholm. He was reckless, violent, and greedy. And if something had gone wrong, if someone recognized him, their entire lives would collapse like a house of cards. She began cleaning their room frantically, searching for anything that would reveal his whereabouts. Then she found it, hidden in his drawer, a blood-stained handkerchief and a keychain with the initials CO. Her hands trembled as she sat down, the weight of the evidence choking her breath. She had been blind too, blind in the name of love, pride, and entitlement. She had covered for Chisholm too many times, believing he was her weapon against the world. But now, that weapon had drawn blood, possibly his father's. The very thought made her stomach churn. Her fear turned to panic when neighbors began whispering that the police were asking questions about a robbery gone wrong. She burned the keychain that night in their backyard, trying to erase the evidence, but the fear remained etched in her face. When Uchenna returned home a week later, limping, thinner, but alive, she didn't know whether to rejoice or run. He looked at her with eyes that had aged 10 years. Where's Chisholm? He asked. Jinika swallowed hard. He traveled to see his cousin in ABA. Uchenna knew she was lying. Silence hung between them for minutes before he said, Tell me the truth. Did you know anything about the robbery? Jinika's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. I didn't plan it. I swear. But he might have overheard something. I told him not to go. Uchenna sank into a chair, holding his head. So it was him, he muttered. My own son tried to kill me. The room spun around him, not from injury, but from the realization that the life he destroyed had risen, and the life he built had turned on him. He thought he had escaped the curse. But maybe the curse wasn't Amarachi or her twins. Maybe the curse was the choices he made. And now, the son he raised with blind pride had raised his hands against him, not in anger, but in greed. Samto stood outside the hospital the following week, arms crossed, staring into the wind like a man carrying the weight of a past he never asked for. His father had been discharged and returned home, but the wound wasn't just physical. It was emotional, generational. Samto hadn't spoken to Ibuka about what they should do next. Their lives had moved forward without Uchenna, yet fate kept pulling them back. Why do I feel guilty for not wanting him in our lives? Samto asked one evening. Ibuka replied, Because you're not like him. That's the proof we're better. They didn't hate their father. They just didn't know how to carry him anymore. Their mother, when asked if they should let him in, simply said, You are men now. Choose your path. But remember, you are not his redemption story. You're your own legacy. Back in Uchenna's house, everything had changed. The air was tense. Jinika no longer walked with pride. She moved like a ghost, whispering instead of shouting, always watching the gate, always afraid. Uchenna barely spoke to her. He sat most days outside the house, staring into the distance. Sometimes he watched children walk by and wondered what Ibuka and Samto looked like at that age, the age he rejected them. He tried writing letters to them, but tore each one halfway. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he wanted to make up for 2 decades of abandonment? The words didn't exist. He began to wither, not just in body, but in spirit. He had been given a second chance, but not a second home. And now he sat with that reality every single day. Ibuka visited one last time. Alone. He sat across from Uchenna and handed him a small envelope. "These are your medical receipts. It's covered. You don't owe me anything," he said. Uchenna opened his mouth to speak, but Ibuka raised his hand. "Let me finish. I'm not here to be your son. I came because I needed to say this face to face. You hurt our mother, and you tried to erase us. But we rose. Not because of you. In spite of you." He stood to leave, then paused. "You were our father, but only by blood. From now on, you're a stranger with a name. I wish you peace, but not a place in our lives." Uchenna didn't cry. He just nodded. The sound of the door closing behind Ibuka felt final. And it was. For now, the road had forked. One father, 2 roads. And only one still led to hope. The other? It led back into the darkness, where someone else was still watching, waiting. The days passed slowly, and the once vibrant Uchenna compound had become a cold tomb of echoes and regrets. The neighborhood children avoided the place, and even Jinika's friends, who once praised her loud jewelry and expensive wrappers, no longer came by. The whispers in the market grew heavier. Some said Uchenna was cursed. Others said karma had come full circle. But the worst was what Uchenna feared the most: silence. His home was now void of joy, purpose, or future. He sat each day by the broken veranda, watching ants crawl across the steps, while his mind drifted to Ibuka and Samto, the sons he never fathered yet owed his life to. Each time he remembered Ibuka's words, "You're a stranger with a name," it stabbed deeper than any bullet ever could. He had been given the gift of survival, yet no one around him celebrated it. He was breathing, but not living. And Jinika? She had become a shadow herself, never meeting his eyes, never speaking unless spoken to. But deep in the folds of the past, something darker was stirring. Chisholm had not returned, and neither had the silence explained his absence. Uchenna tried reaching out to a few distant relatives, hoping to trace his son, but it seemed Chisholm had vanished. One night, unable to sleep, he walked into Chisholm's room. The smell of cigarette smoke still lingered on the bedsheets. He opened the closet and found a phone tucked beneath old jeans. On the screen were messages, encrypted chats with unknown contacts, photographs of Uchenna's land documents, and even an image of the envelope he had carried the day of the attack. Uchenna's knees buckled as he sat on the bed. His hands shook as the realization sunk deeper. Chisholm had planned the attack. But the question that kept drilling into his skull was why. Had greed consumed his only remaining son so deeply? Or was there someone else? Someone pushing the strings from the shadows? The following morning, Uchenna visited the local police quietly and handed them the phone. He didn't reveal the full story, not yet. But he gave them enough to begin a discreet investigation. Days later, an officer returned to his home, lips tight, voice low. "Sir," he said, "we believe this robbery may be connected to something bigger. This wasn't random. Your son wasn't acting alone, and whoever was behind it may still be watching you." That night, Uchenna sat by his window long after Jinika had gone to bed. A car passed slowly in front of the compound, its lights dim, its engine barely humming. It paused at the gate, then rolled away into the night. He felt it in his chest, the tightening that fear brings when danger hasn't left, but simply gone quiet. Somewhere out there, someone still wanted him gone. Not just for money, but for something deeper. And in the final silence he whispered, "Who did I offend that even death came from my own blood?" Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.